It was a hot summer afternoon in Blackwood, a small town surrounded by dense forests and ancient legends. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with orange and purple tones. In a modest house on Rua dos Carvalhos, Daniel Costa, a 25-year-old, sat in his room, surrounded by camping gear and old maps. Daniel was a biology student and a nature enthusiast, but in recent months he had been drawn to something beyond the trees and rivers, the urban legends that surrounded Blackwood. He lived with his parents, but spent most of his time exploring the forests around the city, always looking for something he couldn't explain. Blackwood was known for her scary stories. Many locals swear they have seen strange creatures in the forests or heard screams at night. Daniel always found these stories fascinating, but he never took them seriously until that night. He was going through some old notes when he found a diary that belonged to his grandfather, Jose Costa, a hunter who mysteriously disappeared in 1985. The diary was full of drawings and descriptions of a creature he called the Guardian of the Forest. As Daniel flipped through the diary, a sense of unease began to wash over him. He looked out the window and saw the dark forest in the background, as if she was watching him back. It was as if nature was trying to tell him something. He tried to ignore the discomfort, but one question echoed in his mind. What if all these stories were real? Daniel had always used the legends of Blackwood as inspiration for his research, but now he felt like he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. He got up and walked to the kitchen to get a bottle of water. As he filled the glass, he noticed something strange. An old photo he had never seen before was on the table. It was a faded image of his grandfather, Jose, standing in front of a cabin in the woods. Behind him was a tall, dark figure, barely noticeable. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't remember putting that picture there. That same night, Daniel decided to investigate the origin of the photo. He knew that the hut in the picture still existed, hidden in the heart of the forest. He began to search the city's archives, but each piece of information he found only added to his discomfort. The cabin had been the scene of unexplained events. In the past, disappearances, sudden deaths, and even reports of supernatural creatures. His grandfather, Jose, was the last to have been seen there before he disappeared. As Daniel delved deeper into the story, he began to notice strange things. In his home, objects moved by themselves. He heard footsteps in the hallway, and his dog, Luna, always seemed scared, barking at empty corners. Daniel tried to rationalize everything, but one night he had an experience that changed everything. He woke up in the middle of the night to a sound of footsteps coming from the yard. As he looked out the window, he saw a tall, dark figure with bright eyes watching him from the forest. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you found out that the legends of your city are real? Daniel had always thought he would know the answer, but now he was living this nightmare. He knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. Curiosity and fear mingled in his mind, and he knew he needed to uncover the truth behind that cabin and that photo. But at the same time, he felt like he was messing with something that should have been in the past. Daniel decided he could no longer ignore the signs. He took a flashlight, a hunting knife, and his grandfather's diary. He knew that night would be different. He was about to enter the forest and face the unknown. As Daniel walked towards the forest, he felt the air grow colder and heavier. The lantern fluttered in his hands, and the sounds of the night seemed to intensify. He knew he couldn't go back now. The cabin was there, waiting for him. But what would he find inside? And what did that creature, the guardian of the forest, want with him? Daniel took a deep breath and took the first step into the darkness. He knew that his life would never be the same. Daniel entered the forest, his flashlight illuminating the narrow, root-strewn path. The air was heavy, and the silence was disturbing. He held his grandfather's diary tightly, as if those pages could protect him from what was to come. The cabin was not far away, but every step seemed like an eternity. He knew that the forest guardian was there, waiting for him. The creature his grandfather described in his diary wasn't just a legend, it was real, and Daniel was about to find out what she wanted. As he walked, he began to notice strange marks on the trees. They were deep scratches, as if made by huge claws. He stopped to examine one of the marks and felt a chill run down his spine. This is not from an ordinary animal, he thought. He continued, but now more cautiously, knowing that he was not alone. When Daniel finally arrived at the cabin, he was surprised to see that the door was ajar. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity grew stronger. He pushed the door down slowly, and the creak echoed through the forest. Inside the cabin, the air was even colder, and the smell of mold and rotting wood was almost unbearable. The flashlight illuminated the interior, old furniture covered in dust, shelves full of strange jars, and, in the center of the room, a table with something on top. Daniel approached and saw that it was an old book with yellowed pages and a worn leather cover. He opened the book and began to flip through the pages. They were notes, drawings, and symbols that he could not understand. But one thing caught his eye, a photo of his grandfather, Jose, with a group of people in front of the cabin. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual. As Daniel examined the book, he heard a noise coming from outside. It was a sound of footsteps, slow and heavy. He turned off the flashlight and hid behind a bookcase, holding his breath. The door of the hut opened wide open, and a figure entered. She was tall, with a dark figure and glow-in-the-dark eyes. The guardian of the forest was there. Daniel stood still, trying not to make any noise. He watched the creature move around the hut, as if looking for something. Suddenly, she stopped in front of the table where the book was and emitted a low sound, almost like a growl. It was then that Daniel realized that he was not alone in the cabin. Someone else was there. A voice whispered, "Don't move." Daniel looked to the side and saw a dark-haired woman wearing simple clothes and carrying a knife. She motioned for him to be quiet. The creature seemed not to have noticed them yet. The woman whispered again, "I am Clara. If you want to get out of here alive, do what I say." Clara was a hunter of supernatural creatures, and she had been in Blackwood for months, investigating the disappearances related to the guardian of the forest. She quickly explained that the creature was drawn to fear and that they needed to get out of there before she could detect them. Clara and Daniel left the cabin through the back window, moving silently through the woods. As they ran, Clara explained that the forest guardian wasn't just a creature, it was an ancient entity linked to the land and the people who lived there. She believed that the ritual Daniel's grandfather had participated in was an attempt to control the creature, but something went wrong and she was freed. Daniel was shocked. He never imagined that his grandfather would be involved in something so dangerous. He asked Clara how she knew all this, and she revealed that she was the granddaughter of one of the members of Jose's group. She was trying to fix the mistakes of the past. As they talked, they heard a roar coming from the cabin. The forest guardian had found them. Clara took the knife and said, "Run, I'll hold it." Daniel hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. He ran through the woods, listening to the sounds of the fight behind him. Daniel ran until he couldn't take it anymore, but when he stopped to rest, he realized he was lost. The forest looked different, as if it was alive and moving around you. He looked at his grandfather's diary and saw that a new page had appeared. It was a map showing a path to a place called the Sanctuary. As he tried to understand what was happening, he heard a familiar sound, the barking of Luna, his dog. He followed the sound and found Luna in a clearing, but something was wrong. She was injured, and next to her was a huge footprint, much larger than any animal he knew. Daniel knew he couldn't turn back. He needed to find the sanctuary and uncover the truth behind the forest guardian, but he also knew that the creature was near and he didn't have much time. Daniel followed the map in, his grandfather's diary, trying to ignore the fear that was growing inside him. The forest seemed to close in around him, and the nocturnal sounds were increasingly frightening. Luna, his dog, limped beside him, but seemed determined to keep going. They arrived at a clearing where an old, abandoned structure stood. The sanctuary. It was a stone building, covered with moss and vines, with strange symbols engraved on the walls. Daniel hesitated before entering. The air was charged with a strange energy, and he felt as if he was being watched. He knew that the sanctuary was the key to understanding what was going on, but he also knew that entering there could be dangerous. He looked at Luna, who looked just as scared as he was, and decided he had no choice. He needed answers. Inside the shrine, the air was even colder, and the light from the flashlight could barely illuminate the room. The walls were covered with drawings and symbols that seemed to tell a story. Daniel began to examine the images and realized that they showed an ancient ritual performed to invoke a powerful entity. He recognized some of the symbols from the book he had found in the cabin. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the back of the shrine. It was a low, barely perceptible whisper, but he knew it wasn't his imagination. He followed the sound, with Luna following closely, until he reached a circular room in the center of the sanctuary. In the middle of the room, there was a stone altar, and on top of it, a statue of a creature he recognized immediately. It was the guardian of the forest. Daniel was paralyzed, looking at the statue. He felt a surge of emotions, fear, anger, sadness. He realized that his grandfather and the group had summoned the forest guardian, but something went wrong, and the creature escaped their control. Now, he was caught in the middle of a conflict that began decades ago. He felt betrayed. Why did his grandfather never tell him about it? Why did he leave this curse behind? Daniel felt a mixture of anger and sadness, but also a growing determination. He knew he needed to fix what his grandfather had started, not just for him, but for everyone in Blackwood. As he reflected, Luna began to growl lowly. Daniel looked back and saw a figure at the entrance of the room. It was Clara, the huntress he had met in the cabin. She was injured with cuts and scrapes on her body, but she seemed determined. Clara entered the room, holding the knife firmly. She looked at Daniel and said, "You shouldn't have come here alone. The sanctuary is dangerous." Daniel explained that he was trying to understand what was going on and that he had his grandfather's diary. Clara looked at the diary and sighed. "Your grandfather and my grandfather were part of the same group," she explained. "They summoned the guardian of the forest to protect the city, but something went wrong. The creature got out of control, and they couldn't contain it. Now she's free, and we need to stop her before it's too late." Daniel was shocked by the revelation. He didn't know that Clara was so involved in this. He asked what they needed to do, and Clara explained that there was a ritual that could seal the forest guardian again. But they needed some rare items and a sacrifice. Clara and Daniel began to plan how to perform the ritual. They needed to find 3 items: a moonstone, an elder tree branch, and the blood of a descendant of the original group. Daniel realized that he was the only living descendant, which meant that he would have to make the sacrifice. As they argued, Luna began barking furiously. Daniel looked at the entrance of the room and saw the forest guardian standing there, watching them with bright eyes. The creature was even scarier up close, with sharp claws and an aura of darkness around it. Clara took the knife and said, "We're going to have to fight." Daniel picked up a broken piece of wood from the ground and prepared for the confrontation. The creature rushed forward, and they began to fight. Clara was quick and skilled, but the creature was strong and resilient. Daniel tried to help, but he wasn't a fighter. In the middle of the fight, Daniel was hit by one of the creature's claws and fell to the ground, feeling intense pain. He looked at Clara, who was fighting bravely, but he knew they couldn't win. Like that, it was then that he remembered the ritual. He took his grandfather's diary and began to read the words written in the last pages. As he read, a bright light began to emanate from the altar. The forest guardian stopped fighting and looked at the light as if he was afraid. Clara took advantage of the distraction and attacked the creature, but it was too strong. Daniel knew they were running out of time. He looked at Clara and said, "We need to do the ritual now," Clara agreed, but they needed more time. It was then that Luna, Daniel's dog, advanced towards the creature, barking furiously. The creature looked at her and for a moment seemed to hesitate. Daniel knew this was his chance. He began to recite the words of the ritual while Clara continued to fight. The light from the altar grew brighter and the forest guardian began to retreat. But Daniel knew that this would not be enough. He needed to complete the ritual, and that meant making the sacrifice. Daniel was on his knees on the floor of the sanctuary, holding his grandfather's diary with trembling hands. The light of the altar shone brightly, but he knew that the ritual would not be complete without the final sacrifice. The forest guardian roared, fighting against the energy that held him, while Clara continued to face him. Even though she was injured and exhausted, Luna, his dog, barked furiously, trying to distract the creature. Daniel looked at Clara, who shouted, "Finish the ritual now!" He knew what he needed to do. The sacrifice was the blood of a descendant of the original group, and he was the only one who could complete the ritual. He picked up the knife that Clara had dropped and looked at his hand. Fear and doubt washed over him for a moment, but he knew there was no other choice. He made a shallow cut in his palm, letting the blood drip over the altar. The light shone even brighter, and the forest guardian began to writhe as if he was being pulled into the altar. The creature roared one last time before disappearing in a burst of light and shadows. When the light went out, Daniel fell to the ground, exhausted. He looked at his hands, still trembling, and realized that something had changed inside him. He was no longer the same young man who entered the forest that night. He had faced his greatest fear and done something he never imagined he would be able to do. He had overcome his own limitations. Clara approached him, still holding the knife, but now with a look of relief. "You did it," she said, helping him up. Daniel looked at her and realized that she too had changed. She was no longer just a hunter. She was an ally, someone he could trust. Luna came running towards him, licking his hands as if she knew he needed comfort. Daniel caressed her, feeling a wave of gratitude for her loyalty. He knew that she had risked her own life to help him. As they left the sanctuary, Daniel began to reflect on all that had happened. He thought of his grandfather, Joseph, and what he had been through. He realized that his grandfather wasn't just a hunter. He was a man who tried to protect his family and his city, even if it meant doing terrible things. Daniel felt a mixture of sadness and pride. He knew that it was now his responsibility to ensure that his grandfather's sacrifice was not in vain. Clara looked at him and said, "You did something amazing today, but it's not over. The forest guardian has been sealed, but he is still there, waiting. And there are other creatures, other threats. You can't just go back to your normal life." Daniel knew she was right. He could no longer ignore the supernatural world. He had seen things that would change his life forever, and he knew he needed to keep fighting. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. As they walked back into town, Daniel looked at Clara and said, "I don't know what's going to happen now, but I know I can't do it alone. Will you help me?" Clara smiled and replied, "I've been at this for a long time. Of course I'll help you." They reached the edge of the forest where the town of Blackwood began. The night was clear, and the stars shone in the sky. Daniel looked at the forest one last time, knowing that his life would never be the same again. He had faced the unknown and survived, but he knew that this was just the beginning. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the forest. It was a low, barely perceptible whisper, but he knew it wasn't his imagination. He looked at Clara, who also seemed to have heard. "What was that?" he asked. Clara looked at the forest and said, "I don't know, but I think we'll find out soon." Daniel and Clara returned to Blackwood under the starry sky, but the city looked different. The streets were quieter, and the houses looked gloomier. The ritual at the sanctuary had sealed the forest guardian, but something was still not certain. Daniel felt a restlessness that he could not explain. He knew that his actions had consequences, but he still didn't fully understand what he had triggered. When they arrived at Daniel's house, he found his parents waiting for him. They were worried, but also relieved to see him safe and sound. Daniel tried to explain what had happened, but the words didn't come out right. How could he tell them about supernatural creatures, ancient rituals, and sacrifices? He decided to keep the truth for now, knowing that they would not understand. Clara, on the other hand, seemed more focused. She knew that the sealing of the Forest Guardian was only a temporary victory. "We need to find out what's going on in the forest," she told Daniel. "The ritual may have contained it, but there's something bigger behind it." In the following days, Daniel and Clara began to investigate further. They discovered that the sanctuary was not the only ancient site in the forest. There were other places, marked with the same symbols that Daniel had seen in his grandfather's diary. They also found old records in the city's library, which talked about a group of people who had tried to control the forces of nature for centuries. This group had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only legends and spooky stories. Meanwhile, Luna, his dog, began to act strangely. She barked at nothing and seemed to see things that Daniel couldn't see. He knew she was feeling something, but he didn't know what. It was then that he realized that the sacrifice he had made at the sanctuary might have had a side effect. He began to have strange dreams, where he saw the forest from a different perspective, as if he were connected to it in some way. Daniel and Clara decided they needed to go back to the forest. This time, they were prepared. They brought supplies, weapons, and most importantly, the determination to uncover the truth. When they arrived at the shrine, they found something they didn't expect, a secret door in the ground, covered in ancient symbols. They opened the door and descended a stone staircase that led to an underground chamber. There, they found an altar, similar to the one in the sanctuary, but much older. In the center of the chamber, there was a fountain of crystal-clear water, which seemed to shine with a light of its own. Daniel felt an immediate connection to the source, as if it was calling out to him. Clara explained that the fountain was a point of power, a place where the natural and supernatural worlds met. She believed it was the key to understanding what was happening in the forest. They needed to figure out how to use it to protect the city. As they examined the chamber, Daniel began to hear voices. They were low, barely perceptible whispers, but he knew it wasn't his imagination. He looked at Clara, who seemed to have heard nothing. It was then that he realized that the voices were coming from the source. He approached the fountain and put his hand in the water. Immediately, he was flooded with visions. He saw the forest's past, the ancient rituals, and what had happened to his grandfather's group. He also saw the future, where the forest was on fire and the town of Blackwood lay in ruins. He knew that. Those visions were a warning. Daniel realized that the only way to protect the city was to seal the fountain, but that would mean severing his connection to the forest and losing the power he had gained. He looked at Clara, who seemed to understand what he was thinking. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We can find another way." But Daniel knew there was no other way. He had been chosen for this, and he needed to do what was right. He knelt beside the fountain and began to recite the words he had learned from his grandfather's diary. The water began to glow more brightly, and the voices grew louder. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was being ripped from him. But he kept going, knowing that it was necessary. When the final words were spoken, the light from the source disappeared, and the voices fell silent. Daniel fell to the ground, exhausted, but knowing that he had done what needed to be done. Daniel and Clara returned to the city, knowing that the forest was finally at peace. The forest guardian had been sealed, and the source of power was safe. Daniel knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew he had found a new purpose. He decided to continue working with Clara, protecting the city from other supernatural threats. He also began writing about his experiences, in the hope that one day people would understand the truth about the forest. Luna, his dog, remained by his side, always alert and protective. Daniel knew that she had been a crucial part of his journey, and he was grateful to have her. As Daniel looked out the forest through the window of his house, he felt a sense of peace. He knew he had done the right thing, but he also knew that the supernatural world was vast and full of mysteries. He looked at Clara, who was sitting next to him, and said, "I think this is just the beginning." Clara smiled and replied, "It always is."